Yeah, well, really it's hard to say for sure, but I was good in school. So I was good in math and science. I enjoyed it. My parents were very encouraging for basically everything that I tried. So if I was really good at something else, they would have encouraged that as well, which they did. But I really had an affinity for math and science. My mother was a nurse. My father was a clerk in a steel mill. They were not exactly scientifically inclined. We had Popular Science magazine, so at least that was around. But I did have an uncle, Stanley, who didn't have children of his own, and he was like the uncle who was interested in all of the nieces and nephews because he was just that kind of guy. He was not highly educated, but he was incredibly smart. And he worked in code breaking during World War II and was a surveyor in a small town in Pennsylvania. Never learned to drive, but very mathematically inclined. So he was the guy that I could talk to about mathematical topics, scientific topics, not even in great detail, but he expressed an interest in it, and it became acceptable, kind of almost cool to be interested in science and math, because he kind of gave his seal of approval to it, because he would know something about it, whatever it is that whatever aspect I was interested in. So we were able to have great conversations about that, and so he encouraged it. But it was more just it was more implicit than explicit. No one ever said, hey, this is great, you should do more science or more math. So I was given a lot of leeway. I was just naturally interested. Yeah, so this is a really very common question, and there's an easy answer and there's a hard answer. The easy answer is we can go to any one of a number of websites, reference books, literature surveys, and find a list of the major concerns about human health and performance in long-duration spaceflight. And they're easy to list: bone demineralization, which could lead to a bone fracture, muscle atrophy, things that have to do with the lack of a gravity vector, gravity unloading, cardiovascular issues, changes in the immune system, changes in the gut microbiome. There's a huge number of changes. I would say every body system is impacted in some way, and there are shifts in fluid, body fluids, blood, cerebrospinal fluid, lymphatic fluid, fluids of all kinds, from the lower body to the upper body because of a lack of a hydrostatic gradient in space. We don't know all of the impacts of those yet. We're still learning those. Radiation will probably have an impact. We don't know how much. It will almost certainly increase the lifetime likelihood of getting cancer, but cancer can be a controllable disease in many cases. So, and if the cancer, not to be cavalier, but if the cancer occurs after people have already come back from Mars, then you treat it on Earth, where you have a lot of facilities to do it. So that's the kind of direct answer, in some sense the simple answer. The hard answer is, what are the health concerns that we haven't yet experienced in space that may come up on something like a Mars mission, a 3-year mission? And there are cases of this. I talked about it in my presentation here yesterday. Every time it seems that there was a new class of space flight mission, there was a new class of medical problem. So we didn't see space motion sickness, for example, until the Apollo missions on the US side, until the Apollo missions, because the spacecraft was big enough for the astronauts to move around and make a lot of head movements, which brings on space motion sickness. That's just one example. We didn't see deep vein thrombosis, a clot in the jugular vein, until just a few years ago, and that's after more than 60 years of sending people into space. So the thing that really is a massive concern to me is, what is it that we're going to not see in space until it's too late, until you're at Mars and you haven't prepared for it? So how do you prepare for the unknown? Yeah, so we don't know for sure yet. Certainly a lot of the same precautions that we use for professional astronauts will be applicable to passengers, commercial spaceflight participants, commercial astronauts, whatever we call them. So you want to maintain general good health, get them to exercise and eat right, all of those kinds of things. The calculation, though, is considerably different because the level of health and performance that you expect from somebody in space really depends on what you're sending them there for. So if you're a professional astronaut and your job is to do something very demanding, like maintain the spacecraft, land on Mars, go to the moon and explore and come back, that's a whole different level of performance and health requirement than if you're a space tourist or even a space researcher, like a laboratory scientist like me, to go up into space for maybe for a month to do laboratory research. I would want to maintain a very high standard of health and performance so I could do my job. But if I don't do my job, the health and safety of the rest of the crew does not depend on me. So it really depends on why you're spending people. The real interesting part is going to be when it's already starting to happen, but when we send more people into space on the commercial side who have pre-existing medical problems and possibly even disabilities of various kinds, in that case it's probably going to be specific to each condition. There may not be a general answer. And so how do you know until you've actually flown those people? You're opening up a new level of risk. But again, what you would want to do is, at least for the first few times, monitor them very carefully, make sure there's nothing you've overlooked, and don't expect a lot out of them, at least at first. Just having them survive and come back safely and having enjoyed the experience, that's significant. Yeah, so you hit on resilience is my key word, and that is to my mind, that is the single most important property of an individual astronaut, individual flying in space, at least certainly on the professional level, people that you expect to be doing constructive, useful work in space, whatever that might be, but also the resilience of the mission, which means not only are all the different body systems working properly together, kind of a holistic health or integrative physiology, but are the different people working together? Is everybody getting along? If they're not getting along, is there a way to still carry out the goals of the mission, even if people are not getting along? That's the reality of human interactions. And then how do they interact with the spacecraft when things start breaking down, including the humans? Can the spacecraft, the goals of the mission and the way that they're carried out and the way that other people perform their roles, can those all be properly reconfigured and rearranged to still get something useful done? That's resilience. That's a proper constructive response to an undesired and sometimes unexpected perturbation. So to me, resilience is really the key word. Yeah, well, there's an obvious answer, which is that nobody wants to get motion sick in space. Nobody wants to experience space motion sickness. Space motion sickness put me through graduate school because it was kind of a big deal throughout the 1980s, especially because shuttle flights were relatively short, a couple of weeks at the most. And if you're going to have space motion sickness in space, you're going to be over it probably within 3 days, the vast majority of people who do experience it. But 3 days on a 1 or 2 week mission is kind of a big deal. The overall level of performance and level of return on investment, let's say, on the mission is impacted dramatically if somebody's not performing at full capacity for 3 days. Now you're sending people to the space station for 6 months at a time. Who cares if they're sick for 3 days? I mean, we care, of course, but it's not as big an operational concern. But now that we're talking about sending people back to the moon, They're going to experience G forces, which it's the transitions between G levels that brings on space motion sickness and return sickness. A lot of astronauts experience sickness on return to Earth. They may experience it on going to the moon and Mars and landing there. So you want them to be at their peak of performance when they're experiencing G changes for the first time in days or weeks. So that's one reason we're carrying again. And obviously in the case of commercial spaceflight, at least for the foreseeable future, those missions are not going to be weeks or months long. They're going to be days long, maybe a week or two. So just for the comfort of the crew, the paying customers in many cases, and they may actually, like I said, the example I used before, some of them may be going up there to do scientific research or industrial R&D, commercial R&D. That's a very realistic possibility. You want them to be able to perform at a high level and not be burdened by space motion sickness. So there's a number of reasons, but let me say one other thing about this. You asked specifically about space motion sickness. There are other consequences of neurovestibular adaptation to spaceflight or maladaptation, and that includes lethargy, so-called Sopite syndrome, people just being irritable, problems with spatial orientation if there's an emergency, and because you have your vestibular system is not yet adapted to space completely, you might not be able to find the emergency exit as quickly as possible. So there's more to the neurovestibular system and adaptation than just space motion sickness, and those are operationally relevant. Yeah, so this is a very simple test to assess one aspect, and I have to say one aspect because space motion sickness is a multivariate phenomenon. We think there are multiple contributors, and it's expressed in multiple ways. Like I just described some of them, you can be feeling lethargic or just not up to pulling your duties, tired, irritable, and maybe not even vomit, but still be experiencing space motion sickness. And there are many contributors to them, including some type of predisposition, presumably, that we don't know about, that we don't understand. So one of the things that was found in research performed first by others decades ago, Charlie Markham and Shirley Diamond were some of the first to look at this, and there were some others. They found evidence that an asymmetry in either structure or function between the otolith organs of the vestibular system, the gravity sensors, an asymmetry between the otolith organs on the right side of the head and the left side of the head seems to be a major contributor to space motion sickness, at least for some people, in some cases. I have to give the caveats there. So we have a relatively simple perceptual method of assessing this vestibular asymmetry, and it's due to the fact that one of the ways in which this otolith asymmetry is expressed is that if you take away visual cues, so you do this test in the dark, in many cases, you'll see an asymmetry in positions of the eyes. So vertical positions of the eyes, one eye will be elevated relative to the other, or torsional positions of the eyes around the line of sight. And so we developed a clever way to perceptually measure those without having to actually measure eye movements using a lot of sophisticated and fragile instrumentation. And this we hope is giving us a little bit of insight so that eventually we may be able to predict who's going to experience space motion sickness, and then while they're in space, who's going to experience sickness on return back to Earth, and then do something about it. I think a multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary approach is actually absolutely critical for space research. It's not mandatory. We still make a lot of progress, and there still is a lot to be known in the multitude of different body systems. So I'm not denigrating people who do discipline-specific research. I do it myself in the vestibular area. But even in my particular area, and certainly in my laboratory-based research, I try to turn every experiment into some form of a multidisciplinary experiment. It can be as simple as measuring something you wouldn't necessarily think of measuring. So if I'm going to do a vestibular experiment and expose somebody to a vestibular adaptation paradigm, I think now maybe I should be measuring stress levels, cortisol in the saliva, heart rate variability, skin sweating or galvanic skin response, the conductivity of the skin, variety of stress measures, because if you impose a vestibular adaptive cue, it can stress people out until they've adapted to it. Is that stress good for adaptation because it tells the body that you need to do something? Or is it bad for adaptation just because you're putting the body into a stressful situation in which it can't respond properly? We have some evidence that there's an optimal middle ground. The thing is, it's easy to do this, at least theoretically, to just turn this vestibular experiment into a multivariate experiment. And it is certainly true that when you send people into space, it's true on Earth too, but you definitely see it critically on Earth. There are multiple stressors in space flight, and so there are multiple adaptive processes taking place in the body simultaneously. We should own up to that fact and try to measure as many of them simultaneously as we can. So yes, I think it's critical to do multidisciplinary research, but also very hard. So I think just sending people into space, no matter where they go, no matter where you send them, if we do it right, we're going to learn a lot. So I give a great amount of credit, for example, to people involved in the commercial spaceflight industry, the flight operators, SpaceX among them, but also, or especially, the crew. These are basically paying customers on commercial spaceflight, and yet they've agreed to be subjects for medical and biomedical research projects, mine included. They don't have to do that. And the flight operators don't have to accommodate these experiments, but they do. So there's a recognition that this is important, and even after 60-some years of sending people into space, there's only been fewer than 800 people who have flown into space, and not all of those have been test subjects for any types of medical experiments or measurements. We still have a lot to learn about the human response to spaceflight, let alone the fact that we're talking about going back to the moon, eventually to Mars. Who knows what we're going to learn there when we start spending more time to really explore and follow up on serendipitous observations and take advantage of unexpected findings. As for going to the moon first or going to Mars, it certainly would be nice to go to Mars directly so that I'm more likely to see that mission happen within my lifetime. But I will admit that you can learn a lot about what it's going to take to survive and thrive on Mars by doing it first on the moon, which is still dangerous, make no mistake, but compared to going to Mars, it's incredibly safer because, for a number of reasons, you can come back if there's an emergency. You have support from mission control on near real time, just a few seconds communication delay. At Mars, you're basically on your own. The crew is going to be almost completely autonomous, and we're not yet ready to do that. So you can start to rehearse those kinds of situations on the moon where it's not safe, but it's relatively safe.